Our speaker tonight, like I said, a good friend of the Museum of Flight, is Steve Harper. He is the Director of Chemical Propulsion at Aerojet Rocketdyne, which of course is Seattle's local rocket company, as well as a Museum of Flight corporate sponsor and good friends of the museum. Originally from the UK, Steve immigrated to the US 36 years ago to pursue his passion of a career in the space industry. Since then, he's lived in the four corners of the US, Orlando, Philadelphia, which is where he became a naturalized citizen, Los Angeles, and now the Seattle area, where he presently lives in Sammamish with his wife of 29 years, Diane, and his son, Stuart, who is studying neuroscience at UW and also providing tech support on the other end of the presentation this evening. So thank you, Stuart, for all your assistance there. Steve's passion for World War II all started because of his family's involvement and his interests in military leadership. Over the years, he has focused his research on the Dunkirk evacuation and the D-Day assault. He's been an associate member of the Dunkirk Little Ships Association since 2002 and participated in 2 anniversary crossings in 2005 and 2010, which included approximately 50 of the original little vessels. He's lectured on Dunkirk and D-Day with several U.S. chapters of the International Churchill Society. So please give a virtual round of applause to our presenter tonight, Steve Harper. And with that, Steve, the floor is yours. You take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cal, for your kind introduction, and also a big thank you to the Museum of Flight for hosting me today and honoring this very special occasion during the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. I usually do this presentation in person, so this is a little new for me. Hopefully you can all see the screen clearly. You had a little bit of trouble earlier with the formatting. As Cal mentioned, I like to take questions as they arise. It's hard to do over the computer, but please feel free to use the chat function at any point, and Cal will jump in and I'll be happy to try and answer questions. I tend to present a lot of materials in this presentation that folks are not familiar with D-Day, so please feel free to chime in. Well, as you know, 76 years ago today, something amazing happened that really directly impacted the outcome of World War II. D-Day was really the result of years and years of planning and training involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers who were subsequently followed literally by millions, all of them contributing to the eventual destruction of the Nazi threat. Unfortunately, as Cal mentioned, because of the pandemic, the usual ceremonies in northern France aren't happening today. And those beautiful cemeteries and beaches are mostly still and quiet. Despite that, I hope that all of you, like me, will reflect on this today and offer up a little prayer or a moment of remembrance to honor all those brave soldiers who took part in this and all those who gave their lives to uphold the cause of freedom all those years ago. Indeed, I'd like to make mention for all our veterans and servicemen and women who continue to do the same. As Colin mentioned, I grew up in the UK. I kind of call it, I grew up under the long shadow of World War II. I had 5 relatives that served, 4 uncles and a grandfather. 2 of them were killed, 2 of them were wounded. Ironically, it was my grandfather who was the eldest, who volunteered to serve on one of the Dunkirk little ships that survived the whole war without a scratch. He was 67 years old when he was honorably discharged on VE Day. But it was one of my uncles that went in on Juno Beach on D-Day that raised my attention. And during my pilgrimage to his grave in 2002, that ignited my passion to get interested in D-Day and learn as much as I could about operations Neptune and Overlord. So this presentation is sort of a result of that. It's a mix of family involvement and historical fact, but presented through the lenses of, I would say, both the British and the Americans, my old home and my new home. So it tends to go fairly quickly, so hopefully you can keep up. Churchill, I think, said it best when he said, all great things are simple and most of them can be described in single words. The themes of this story revolve around real leadership, planning, execution of task, and relationships, all the special relationships that evolved between the two countries and indeed all the allies throughout the war. Of course, story can't be told without the context, and this really all goes back to the aftermath of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and the war reparations that inflicted really hardships and stress on the German and the area at that time. That led to the rise of fascism and Nazi build-up in the 30s, which Churchill, of course, warned about extensively, of course, which everybody ignored. And then the tipping point finally came the 1st of September 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland. That precipitated Britain and France to declare war a few days later. Nothing much happened for quite a few months. They called it the phony war. But then on May 10th of 1940, the Blitzkrieg occurred. Churchill became prime minister on that day. Europe was overtaken within a few days. That led to the evacuation of Dunkirk between 26th of May, 4th of June 1940, subsequently the Battle of Britain, subsequently the Blitz. Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 brought the US into the war. And then obviously lots of other history between 1940 and D-Day. This is perhaps my favorite family photograph. Probably a lot of you won't recognize it. It's actually number 10 Downing Street. It was Thursday afternoon, August 31st, 1939. The very next day, Germany would invade Poland. And 3 days after that Thursday, Britain and France would declare war. That little boy in the lower left-hand corner, that's my dad. After Dunkirk, Churchill made two great speeches. The one was the Never Surrender speech. That was delivered on June 4th. And my favorite, his Finest Hour speech, was delivered on June 18th. Finest Hour speech is a very long speech, and if you've never read it, I strongly recommend you do. It's a fantastic speech. It's actually a blueprint to the British people of why they would win the war. And it's incredibly moving, incredibly rousing. Everybody's familiar with the sort of last key point in the final paragraph of this will be their finest hour. But in that paragraph, there's a couple of other nuggets that I really like that I captured here. Hitler knows that he must break us in this island or lose the war. And if we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free. These were really key points at that time. Remember, Britain had just been decimated in France, the evacuation of Dunkirk. Literally had very limited resources, entirely on its own. Things looked pretty bad, and for Churchill to make such a rousing speech was very inspirational at that time. Great Britain held. She held for 4 years, 2 years alone, with remarkable hardships, but held up. And America provided almost unlimited resources, a little bit slow at the beginning because of the isolationist policies in the US at the time, and a great preference not to get involved in another war. And it was during those early days that special relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill started to develop. And I'm going to get into that in a lot more detail with some critical individuals from the US that came to Britain and are well described in a book called Citizens of London, which I'll talk more about. The Lend-Lease Act was really the primary vehicle that allowed the formalities of the support of Britain through a trade agreement. They basically traded strategic land bases for supplies. That, of course, strengthened the relationship as the years went on, and we'll get into that in a lot more detail. Britain, of course, was pounded during and after the Blitz, initially the airfields, then London, the industrial Midlands, the cities. Subsequently, towards the end of the war, by V1 and V2, the vengeance weapons. And in fact, my father's home up in Aberdeen in Scotland, where we're all from, was actually bombed in June 1943. They went without glass in that home for a year because they couldn't get it. And then after all that, they're prepared to go back and free Europe. And that's what D-Day is all about. Here's the iconic picture of St. Paul's Cathedral. It was actually at the end of 1940, the evening of December 29th through the 30th. It's the 114th night of the Blitz. And that particular night was a bad night for incendiary bombs that had been dropped that set most of London aflame. It's interesting to note, City of London was bombed for 76 consecutive nights. Pretty hard to believe. More than 1 million homes in London were destroyed or damaged. Over 67,000 civilians were killed, half of them in London. And of course, after London, many of the other towns and cities across the country followed, especially the Midlands, where I grew up. But a lot of that bad news was kept quiet from the people because Churchill didn't want that news to get out. For those of you that have been to London, you're probably familiar with the Underground. During the war, it was used as a refuge. People would go down and stay there. I always liked the stories and the legends that there was never any theft or any bad behavior, that people just generally took care of themselves, very well protected down there. Another thing that people don't know is that a lot of children were evacuated from the cities at that time, about 3.5 million of them. And each of those little kids had their gas masks and a little label, like a mailing label, that would identify them and where they were to go. And you can see some photographs here. Must have been a very painful time for the moms and dads and the parents and the children that were sent away. Buckingham Palace was first bombed in September of 1940. The Queen at the time, Queen Elizabeth, or the Queen Mum, she became to be known, said, "I'm glad we have been bombed. Now I can look the East End in the face." That, of course, was because the East End of London was getting hammered at that time. When she was asked when the children would be evacuated, the Queen replied by saying, "Children will only leave the palace if their mother leaves. The mother will only leave the palace if the king leaves. And the king will not leave the palace under any circumstances whatsoever." The palace was bombed 7 times in total, and the Brits admired and respected them for standing by the people. I suspect many of you will recognize this gentleman, Joseph Kennedy, JFK's father. He was the US ambassador to Britain in 1940, and he made a very famous statement at the time, declaring that democracy was finished in England in November 1940, and basically felt that Britain was done for. As you might imagine, a lot of the Brits didn't think too highly of that. They widely thought he was a defeatist. He would typically retreat to the countryside during the bombings and get out of the fray at a time when all the royal family, Prime Minister, all the other ambassadors and leading officials choose to stay in London. This prompted one lady in Britain's Foreign Office to say, "I thought my daffodils were yellow until I met Joe Kennedy." Shortly after Pearl Harbor, in a session with Congress, Churchill said, "In the days to come, the British and American peoples will, for their own safety and the good of all, walk together side by side in majesty, in justice, and in peace." He also said, "If we are together, nothing is impossible, but if we are divided, all will fail." I want to call out a book. It's probably one of the best books I've read on the war years and the European theatre by Lynn Olson, Citizens of London, lady I was privileged to meet. In fact, my copy of the book is signed by her. It's a very detailed account of many of the Americans who stood with Britain in its darkest, finest hour. I'm going to get into a little more detail on this one, but it really is a very, very interesting account of the broad spectrum of people from the US that were involved with the UK and helped develop that portfolio of special relationships. The last paragraph of the book, which I've got right here, captures a speech from a young Eric Severeid, who was a CBS correspondent, young American, 27 years old, said in October of 1940, when he was being dispatched back to the US after having fallen in love with London, he said, "When this is all over in the years to come, men will speak of this war and say, I was a soldier, or I was a sailor, or I was a pilot. Others will say with equal pride, I was a citizen of London," which is obviously where the name of the book comes from. I wonder how many of you recognize this gentleman. This is John Gill Winant. Gill Winant became the US ambassador to Great Britain after Joseph Kennedy. This man was a remarkable leader, and I think, quite honestly, one of America's greatest heroes that most Americans have never heard of. When he went to Britain in March of 1941, he was actually met at the railway station by King George VI, because both King George VI and Churchill and all the other British officials realized that a relationship with America was critical and that this gentleman was a very important gentleman. Gill Winant rapidly assimilated, became a very good friend to Britain, and relayed a lot of vital information back to Roosevelt. He would stay in London during the bombings, and indeed, as a show of solidarity, he would follow the rations for the common people in Britain, and they greatly respected that. He would also, after the air raids, go out and help the firefighters clean up and help recover people from the wreckage. He very, very rapidly became exceptionally popular in Britain. People had a huge respect for him. Averell Harriman, he was the son of a Union Pacific Railroad baron, very wealthy family, well connected with the Roosevelts. He got assigned as the Lend-Lease Act administrator and sent over to Britain, also became another strong friend of Britain, confidant of Roosevelt, and helped guide and develop that special relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt. And finally, Edward R. Murrow, he's probably the most famous out of those three gentlemen, the CBS war correspondent. He actually first came over to the UK in 1936, again, rapidly fell in love with the place and provided just incredible coverage of the war from the UK for most of it. Another interesting aspect of early American involvement was the All-American Eagle Squadron. This was actually a Royal Air Force squadron that was put together solely with American pilots. And remember, at the time, it was against US law to fight for a different country. And in fact, the FBI threatened to revoke the citizenship of these men. I've never been able to find a case in my research where that actually happened, but there was a lot of people that went over to do that, which is very interesting. Nearly 3 million Americans were sent to Britain prior to D-Day, most of them arriving in 43, mostly in 44, before the landings. Again, another interesting consequence of that was 70,000 GI war brides. How about that for some special relationships? As the American GI sailed across the Atlantic, they were given a book to read. Actually, they were given a pamphlet. You can actually find this online. It's incredibly interesting. It's got quite a few pages in it, and I'll show you some excerpts in the next few slides. But in those days, it was just pages of paper. It wasn't a book. One of the early sections says the best way to get on in Britain is very much the same as the best way to get in America. Same sort of courtesy and decency and friendliness. They go over big in America, we'll go over big in Britain. The Britons have seen a good many Americans, and they like Americans. They will like your frankness as long as it is friendly. They will expect you to be generous. Remember, there's a lot of rationing going on. They are not given to backslapping, and they are shy about showing their affections. But once they get to like you, they make the best friends in the world. Don't be misled by the British tendency to be soft-spoken and polite. If they need be, they can be plenty tough. The English language didn't spread across the oceans and over the mountains and jungles and swamps of the world because these people were panty waists. 60,000 British civilians, men, women, and children, have died under bombs, and yet the morale of the British is unbreakable and high. A nation doesn't come through that if it doesn't have plain common guts. The British are tough, strong people and good allies. You won't be able to tell them much about taking it. They are not particularly interested in taking it anymore. They are far more interested in getting together in solid friendship with us so that we can all start dishing it out to Hitler. At home in America, you're in a country at war. Since your ship left Fort, however, you've been in a war zone. You will find that all of Britain is a war zone and has been since September 1939. All this has meant a great change in the British way of life. The British will welcome you as friends and allies, but remember that crossing the ocean doesn't automatically make you a hero. There are housewives in aprons and youngsters in knee pants in Britain who have lived through more high explosives in air raids than many soldiers saw in first-class barrages in the last war. And this last piece, my favorite. The British don't know how to make a good cup of coffee. You don't know how to make a good cup of tea. It's an even swap. Believe you me, having lived on both sides of the Atlantic for quite a few years, I know that to be very true. Finally, in the very last page, it says, don't try to tell the British that America won the last war or make wisecracks about the war debts or the British defeats in the war. Never criticize the king or queen. Remember, the king and queen were very popular at the time by the Brits. Don't criticize the food, beer, or cigarettes to the British. Remember, they had been at war since 39. Use common sense on all occasions. This bit's really interesting to me. By your conduct, you have a great power to bring about a better understanding between the two countries after the war is over. And again, I think that is the behavior and the magnitude of the Americans that were over, I think, had a great deal to do with the development of those special relationships and how the two countries became close during and after the war. Finally, it closes, you will soon find yourself among kindly, quiet, hardworking people who have been living under a strain such as few people in the world have ever known. In your dealings with them, let this be your slogan. It is always impolite to criticize your hosts. It is military stupid to criticize your allies. Well, the GIs charmed their way into favor. They were stationed everywhere in the UK. An American charm quickly thawed traditional British reserve. They were generally welcomed everywhere by the Brits, and they generally reciprocated with generosity because of all the rationing and hardships there. British parents tended to adopt some of the younger soldiers whose sons were already at war or already lost. And of course, many of the Yanks were admired by the British women. The GI generosity became legendary, particularly with children and women. Many of the American GI older soldiers that were fathers adopted British children metaphorically, particularly the orphans, and were very, very kind to them. And pretty much all the US bases regularly held children's parties and supplied the schools with food. They were generally really surprised how rough it was in Britain at the time. Interestingly enough, the American soldier was paid 6 times more than his British counterpart, British Tommy. And of course, as you might imagine, that caused a little bit of resentment from some of the British soldiers and came up with the comment there, overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Initial planning for invasion of Europe actually started in 1940 by Churchill. After the Germans attacked Russia, Stalin, of course, made a great demand for a second front as early as possible. Things really didn't get going until the meeting in Casablanca in January 1943. And at that point, it was designed to set up a chief of staff to start planning for such an event. First person to be assigned that position was a British officer, General Frederick Morgan, and he held that position for quite a while. At the time, it was expected that the Supreme Commander would be a Brit, which was why a British person was assigned as the chief of staff. That changed, of course, going forward, and we'll get to that later. By the Washington Conference in May of '43, it was decided that total priority would be given to the invasion, and a tentative date, 1st of May, was set. And the first outline plan was presented at that meeting. This is one of the most important charts in the slide deck. I think it's really important to understand the whole concept of amphibious assault. And it really is the most complex of all military maneuvers because it involves coordinated attacks between the air, sea, and land forces. And there's 2 critical pieces to this. The first is have to attack in overwhelming force, which is typically regarded as 3-to-1. And then equally important, perhaps more important, you then have to resupply to the front faster than the enemy. And of course, that's extremely difficult to do when you're coming from the sea. So that's a key point. The early planning, as I said, was developed by Frederick Morgan, the chief of staff. It was based upon plans that Bertram Ramsay had developed. Bertram Ramsay was a vice admiral during the Dunkirk days. He was actually responsible for the Dunkirk evacuation. Very good at logistics, very good at planning, another exceptional leader. And he did a lot of work in the early planning days for cross-channel assaults of Europe. Normandy was quickly selected because of the Cherbourg Harbor. We'll get more to that later. and also because it was perceived to be a weaker section of the Atlantic Wall. There was a lot of deception going on in these days to confuse the Germans on where they would go. And during those early planning stages, when they were told they need a harbor in order to resupply to the front fast of the enemy, they said, okay, we'll bring our own. Plan was approved in 43. Admiral Ramsay was then promoted to be the Allied Naval Commander-in-Chief for the Allies in 43. And then Eisenhower was assigned as the Supreme Commander in January 41. Montgomery, he was the guy that really drove a drastic increase in the number of men to assault Europe from 3 divisions up to 5. And Ramsay was the guy to provide the logistics. He had been doing a lot of deception work as well, Operation Anvil, to try and confuse the Germans.
Can I interject with a question from the? Can I interject with a question from the chat here, Steve?
Yeah, go ahead.
Wendy asked, was there an earlier invasion attempt that failed?
There was an invasion attempt in Normandy, Norway, very early in the war that was a complete disaster. It was a localized effort. I don't really know too much about it, but Normandy was really the main one. Nothing before really has any significance.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah. So Germany thought that they would cross at the narrowest point, the Pas de Calais, and for years they planned to go to Cherbourg. The reason for Cherbourg was in order to resupply to the front, you needed a deep water port. The Germans had destroyed all the ports in France, in fact, along the Atlantic Wall. But it was quickly realized that an assault on the Normandy beaches could capture the Cherbourg Peninsula and therefore secure the port. It had to be rebuilt, but that was all part of the plan. So that was the real reason they went to Normandy. Just a quick question on the Allied leaders. Combination of Brits and Americans. At the back was Omar Bradley. Admiral Ramsay is the second from the left. He's a bit of a hero to me. I know his son. And my grandfather actually sailed with him in World War I, and they knew each other. Next to him is Lee Mallory, one of the Air Force leads. And then Bedell Smith, he became Ike's chief of staff after Morgan. On the bottom row is Tedder, head of the Royal Air Force. Eisenhower, obviously, Supreme Commander, and Montgomery. The overall plan was actually quite simple. Ramsay's plan, really. Vast aerial power to control the skies, huge armada of ships to assault the coast, almost 300 minesweepers that would clear the way, warships to follow to bombard the defenses, and then a troop-carrying convoy of over 4,000 landing craft carried 130,000 soldiers. The bit that few people know was the bit about the harbors, the Mulberry Harbors, 2 of them, 146 pieces of them, 6 miles of flexible roadway. And the 2 harbors are designated A and B, A for America, B for Britain. We'll talk more of them. And that goes back to that whole point of having to resupply to the front faster than the enemy. The assault forces comprised 5 divisions from 2 armies, the British Second Army led by Montgomery and the US First Army by Bradley. And you're all intimately familiar with the 5 code names and the different divisions that supported them: Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha, and Utah. 2 air forces supported the assault, the US 9th Air Force and the RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force. Both were under the command of Lee Mallory, Royal Air Force. Interestingly enough, they had very significant management reserves, which was 2 more air forces, the US 8th Air Force and RAF's Bombers Command. And the bottom line in terms of air support, just massive, massive resources and firepower, overwhelming odds. Almost 2,500 fighters and fighter bombers and 700 light medium bombers, just amazing power. There were 72 US 8th Air Force bases in the UK at the time. You can see the map here that shows it. and just incredible activity leading up to the event, softening up the defenses in France just in the days before and the immediate days afterwards before the assault. Some of the key Air Force statistics are pretty interesting because they were so dire. So 12,000 bombers were shot down in World War II. Between 1939 and 45, the Allies dropped 3.4 million tons. That averages out to about 1,000 tons of bombs per day, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. 2/3 of Allied bomber crews were lost for each plane destroyed. And a very interesting statistic here, 6 bomber crewmen were killed for each one wounded. It was really pretty hard, pretty hard life in that world. And over 100,000 Allied bomber crewmen were killed over Europe during that time. So drilling closer to D-Day, air support on the beaches, a lot of squadrons, as I said, overwhelming power. 171 squadrons of RAF and American Air Force fighters, 15 squadrons providing shipping cover, 54 beach cover, 33 bomber escort and offensive fighter sweeps, 36 squadrons struck at specific targets, and 36 provided direct air support to the invading forces. It's interesting to note, and the movie The Longest Day captures this quite well, that the pushback from the Luftwaffe was almost, negligible, just a few aircraft, not even worth mentioning. On the 6th of June, 44, our friend Churchill again made a famous speech. The hour of our greatest effort and action is approaching. We march with valiant allies who count on us as we count on them. And when the signal is given, the whole circle of avenging nations will hurl themselves upon the foe and batter out the life of the cruelest tyranny which has ever sought to bar the progress of mankind. An armada of almost 7,000 ships, overflown by 13,000 aircraft, landed 156,000 troops on the beaches of Dunkirk that day. Greatest amphibious assault in history. It was orchestrated through 2 major operations. The naval operation called Operation Neptune, which was led by Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay. As I mentioned, he was the head of the Dunkirk evacuation, and his biography, which is unfortunately out of print, but a very interesting read, is called Full Cycle. Irony, of course, because he rescued an army of just over 300,000 men with approximately 700 boats. And then a few years later, he got to take almost 3 million men back with a flotilla of almost 7,000 ships. Pretty ironic. Operation Overlord, of course, the main assault led by General Eisenhower, and the sustaining operations that followed through the Mulberry Harbors, keeping that front resupplied. And that, of course, opened up the second front and led to the final destruction of Germany. Just some details on Bertram Ramsay's fleet: 6,833 ships, 1,212 warships, 4,026 landing ships and landing craft, 731 ancillary vessels, and a lot of merchant vessels. About 78% of those vessels were British and Canadian, 17% were American, and just a handful were French, Norwegian, Dutch, Polish, and Greek. Ironically, there were more people manning the ships than actually went in on the assault. Almost 200,000 people allocated to all those vessels supporting that initial assault, Royal Navy and US Navy, Allied support, of course. Here's just a schematic of the orchestration. I thought it was interesting that their rendezvous point was called Piccadilly Circus, after the famous point in London, and then the pass into the 5 beaches, 3 British Canadian beaches and the 2 American beaches, Utah and Omaha. Won't get into the details here. There's a lot of details, but again, basically 2 armies involved in the assault. The British Second Army, with a lot of Canadian and Allied support, comprised of about 83,000 men, mostly Brits and Canadians, but obviously French, Polish, other Allied nations, Australians, New Zealand, etc. US First Army under Bradley, that comprised about 73,000 men, including over 15,000 in the airborne groups. And the beaches, as you all know, hopefully many of you have been there. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. You won't regret it. It's well worth going. Beautiful place, very moving. The casualties on D-Day, around 9,500, pretty severe. The attrition rates, Omaha usually gets a lot of attention. That was a very well-defended beach and took a lot of losses. But the real losses in terms of attrition rates went to the airborne divisions, both the US and the UK. Very, very heavy losses as those folks parachuted in to take critical targets before the key assault. This is another one of my favorite photographs, just a few days after D-Day. I think the key point here is overwhelming force and that theme of resupply to the front faster than the enemy. I mean, you just look at that photograph and there's just no more room to get any more ships in there. It's just a remarkable photograph of military assets and military power. And that didn't even include the harbors, which takes me to the Mulberry Harbors. So the Mulberry Harbors were two artificial harbors, A and B. They were built in complete secrecy in the UK. A, American for Omaha Beach, and B for Britain, Gold Beach. It was nicknamed Port Winston. They comprised about 150 caissons, 6,000 tons each, 200 feet long, big concrete pontoons that were built in various dry docks around the UK and then towed into position. Included 6 miles of flexible steel roadways. They sunk old World War II battleships and vessels as breakwaters for the harbors as well. And another irony and sort of link back to Dunkirk was the officer that was responsible for orchestrating the deployment of the Mulberry Harbors was Bill Tennant, a Rear Admiral Bill Tennant. And he was actually Ramsay's beachmaster at Dunkirk. An interesting story on the Mulberry Harbors is the way they were both assembled, and I kind of like it because it's reflective of the cultures of the Americans and the British and how they sometimes are not aligned. The Americans tend to do things very quickly, very decisive, lickety-split, and they got their harbor assembled very, very quickly. But they took a few shortcuts. They didn't anchor it to the bottom. There are a few other things that they did, but because they moved so quickly, they got it operational really fast. And that was very, very very, very fortunate. Unfortunately, when a bad storm came on June 19th, because it hadn't been so thoroughly built, it was destroyed. The British harbor took much, much longer to assemble by the Brits. Again, I think a sign of their culture. They tend to build their houses from rocks rather than wood, do things by the book, quite slow and methodical. But that thing lasted 10 months, and it ultimately deployed 2.5 million men. Ironically, both were needed. We needed one quickly, which the Americans provided, and we needed one to last, which the Brits did. So I thought that was a nice sort of marriage there in terms of critical logistic support for this endeavor. Here's just some photographs of it. The one on the top right is actually Southampton, UK, in one of the dry docks where some of the caissons were poured. And again, you just get the idea of what they did. Got some more photographs here of those concrete pontoons that were really quite large and how they were all installed. You can see on this shot the what they called the block ships and the gooseberries, the breakwaters that they put out as they built the harbor. This is a nice aerial shot from October of '44, Mulberry B. Gives you an idea of the scale and size, and even at that point they were still loading lots and lots of logistic supplies to just keep that front resupplied faster than the enemy. If you go to Normandy today, I was last there in 2002. It's the one only time I've been there. But if you go to Arromanches, you can still see the remnants of the Mulberry Harbor, and there's a wonderful museum there with some models of how those harbors actually worked, and that's how I first got really made aware of them. It's pretty interesting. Highly recommend you visit that place. There was also a thing called Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. It was an undersea pipeline that they laid from the UK. There's actually two of them, one from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg and another one across the Pas de Calais. And that was just to resupply diesel because you can imagine they needed a lot of diesel. So that's how they solved that problem. Here's a picture of Omaha Beach. And we were there on June 6, D-Day 2002. I'd always been told that it was hallowed ground, and indeed the day I was there, not a soul walked on that beach, even though it was a pretty nice day, a little bit of drizzle, but a lovely day. On the top right there, you can see the Pointe du Hoc. If you actually can see some of the little people there on top of that, it gives you an idea of the scale, and the height of those cliffs is several hundred feet. It is absolutely amazing to me that the American Rangers got up there. Again, The Longest Day movie, I think, does a reasonably good job of portraying that assault, which was truly, truly remarkable. The American Cemetery Coleville-sur-Mer has 9,300 graves, primarily of the 1st, 4th, and 29th U.S. Infantry Divisions. Again, if you've not been there, I would highly encourage it. Very moving, absolutely gorgeous place. The graves are kept, the whole facility is pristine. All the crosses point home to the west. Very, very moving. Similarly with the British Cemetery at Bayeux, just over 4,500 soldiers buried here. Very similar, just absolutely pristine, very moving. Here's my uncle, Doug Hebenton, he was a private in the Gordon Highlanders on my father's side. He landed on Juno Beach on D-Day with the Canadians, became part of the offensive against Caen, was shot on patrol on the 26th of July and died the following morning. Age 26, left a wife and 4 children. I'm still in contact with one of his sons, also called Douglas, who's 88 now and lives in Aberdeen. Here's Doug's grave at the British Cemetery, me with my mom and dad in 2002. That was my dad that was in front of number 10 Downing Street in 1939. He died a few years ago. But here's Doug's grave. It was very moving to actually go visit there. I would draw your attention to this plaque. I'll read it. It basically says, "The land on which this cemetery stands is the gift of the French people for the perpetual resting place of the sailors, soldiers, and airmen who are honored here." And it was really beautiful. I just might add, if I go back, if I can, one couple of slides. This little building here in the British Cemetery had a visitor's book that you could sign in and leave a message. And I was very moved. I had to write a little note. So I put in a personal note that just simply said, "Thank you for saving the world," which I think is very poignant because that's exactly what they did. We also visited the German cemetery there, which was rather somber. There's 23,000 graves there. A bit of a dreary day by the time we got to that one. We visited Lend-Lease, famous town where the 82nd 101st Airborne parachuted in. You can see on this day, in June 6, 2002, they had an effigy, if you like, of one of the airborne stuck to the side. His parachute stuck to the side of the church. Again, in the movie The Longest Day, that was Red Buttons that did that, you may remember. Pegasus Bridge was the first target to be assaulted. This was a critical target for 2 reasons. It was one of the main bridges over the Orne River that linked the beaches to the mainland. And you could either get tanks off the beaches inwards, or more ominously, you could bring panzer tanks onto the beaches. The Allies knew panzer tanks, the divisions were not that far away. It was absolutely essential that this bridge be captured. It was one of the primary targets. You can see at the back there, the Horsa gliders so close to that bridge. And the field back here, I don't know if many of you have heard of something called Rommel's asparagus, but Rommel's asparagus was an anti-glider system. It was basically a series of like small telegraph poles that they would anchor and spike into the ground. And if those gliders came into land, they would get torn to shreds by hitting all those spears. Ironically, that field behind Pegasus Bridge was due to get its Rommel's asparagus on June the 7th. So remarkable that didn't happen a day earlier and that mission was successful. Again, in the Longest Day movie, you may recall they assault Pegasus Bridge and use the term hold until relieved, hold until relieved. So Major John Howard and his group from the UK 6th Airborne had to hold that bridge for quite a few hours until the British commandos under Lord Lovat arrived about 1:30 in the afternoon. And it's an interesting story with him because he was a Scot and he brought along his bagpiper, Bill Millin, and he ordered him to play a lot, which was kind of interesting, announcing that to the Nazis that they were coming. And the Nazis were so outraged by that, they put 100,000 Reichsmarks on both Millin's head and Lovat's head, which of course was never collected. Bill Millin, of course, a true person, known as Piper Bill. He was a personal piper to Simon Fraser, who was Lord Lovat, head of the Commando Special Service at D-Day. And again, as I mentioned, as soon as they came into land, Lovat ordered Millin to start playing the bagpipes. And as you guys probably know, those things are pretty noisy, get a lot of attention. And Bill Millin wasn't too happy about it. Now he started complaining to Lord Lovat. Lord Lovat replied, well, you know, don't quote the regulations to me, laddie. That's from the English War Office, and you and I are both Scottish, so that doesn't apply. So just play the bagpipes and shut up, keep playing, which he did. And of course, he actually played himself in the movie The Longest Day, which is quite interesting. Back to Pegasus Bridge, Richard Todd's a British actor that some of you may be familiar with. He was very famous in the UK in the 50s and 60s. Played Wing Commander Guy Gibson in the Dam Busters movie, the 24-year-old leader of that raid on the German dams. And he actually played Major John Howard in The Longest Day. That's a picture of Richard Todd at the bottom playing that part. And again, you may remember he was sitting in the glider, reminiscing to himself his orders of hold until relieved. Well, in real life, he actually parachuted into Pegasus Bridge and actually met up with the real John Howard at that bridge, as he was a captain in the British Airborne Division. He was awarded the OBE by the Queen later life and died in 2009. Interesting. So key takeaways from all this. It wouldn't have been possible without the remarkable leaders. And there are leaders top to bottom, from the politicians through the military leaders, through the officers and the men. Can't emphasize enough the meticulous planning driven by Admiral Ramsay of Dunkirk experience. Serendipity always plays a part. The weather was a big variable, and it took a lot of courage from Eisenhower to make the decision to go, even though the weather was pretty suspect. But as it played out, it was okay. And a great deal of deception to the Germans, trying to fool them on where the assault was actually going to come. The execution of the mission with overwhelming force was also just an incredible accomplishment. That theme of overwhelming force, huge air force, huge naval force, huge army, 3 divisions increased to 5, driven by Montgomery, and then just the massive fleet to sustain the logistics of the resupply and the use of the Mulberry Harbors that deployed eventually 2.5 million men and over 4 million tons of hardware by D-Day plus 100 days. Absolutely incredible. When it was all over, Roosevelt said the Normandy invasion was a brilliant success that owed much to the Mulberry Harbors. You know, that was Churchill's idea, and that was true. It actually was way back when they, in the early days of the planning. Eisenhower also said Mulberry exceeded our best hopes. It was such a critical logistical success. And Bradley also commented basically the same thing. Interestingly enough, Albert Speer, who's one of the German war production ministers, made an interesting comment saying that the Allies made the Nazis' Atlantic Wall irrelevant because they bypassed it with a single brilliant technical device. So that thing was the enabler of the success of Normandy. A couple of postscripts mentioned earlier about special relationships. Averell Harriman became a key guy, liaison between Churchill family and the British government and Roosevelt. He was not considered to be a particularly smart man, but I think history has been a little unfair to him because he actually, in my opinion, did a really good job and became a very successful diplomat, not only with Roosevelt, but subsequently with Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson. Interestingly enough, he ended up marrying Pamela Churchill. How about that for a special relationship? Similarly with Edward R. Murrow, interesting aftermath. He had an affair with Pamela Churchill during the early years. He profited greatly from his wartime triumph, but he never felt at home in New York after the war. He really liked London and he missed it, and he really liked the BBC. He died in 1965 at the age of 57 from lung cancer. He was a heavy smoker, as was King George VI. He also died at the age of 57. And right before his death, Queen Elizabeth, I believe it was March or April of 65, made him a Knight of the British Empire. The Prime Minister at the time, Harold Wilson, just commented, Murrow had been an honorary Brit since he'd first arrived in 1936. Probably the saddest news is what happened to Gill Winant. He had a secret love affair with Sarah Churchill and was very attracted to her. He was the second and last American to be awarded the Honorary Order of Merit by King George VI, got it in January of 47. The only other person to get it was Eisenhower. The Queen at the time, the Queen Mom, said to Gill, you deserved it more than anyone because of all the things that he did to help the British people during those inter years between the start of the war and the end. And the great tragedy here is that he committed suicide in Concord, Pennsylvania in November of 47, penniless, broke. And that happened in the US. He was essentially unknown, but in the UK, he was like a rock star. The people were devastated. They just absolutely adored him. It was terrible news to them when they found this out. And a person at a pub in London made a famous comment, we all lost a friend in him. And many of the British people thought that. Final comment on Churchill. Churchill became the first foreign national to receive an honorary US citizenship in April of 63. That award was basically made happen by JFK, commented that Churchill's bravery, charity, and valor, both in war or peace, had been a flame of inspiration in freedom's darkest hour. At the time, Churchill was 88, was too frail to travel, so he actually watched the ceremony from his home via satellite, and his son Randolph actually accepted the honor on his behalf. What I found interesting to learn that even by that point, 8 separate states in the US had already granted honorary citizenship to Churchill. He died in 65, age 90. His mother was American. He used to say he was half American and wholly British. I always liked that comment. But I think in retrospect, many of us will agree he's perhaps the world's greatest statesman and certainly one of America's greatest allies. I think the special relationships between the people that were involved, from the politicians on down to the enlisted men, became very deep and lasting. And I've read a lot of books that get into that and all the relationships and emotions and feelings that emerge. One of my favorites is a comment from a young boy in Birmingham, the UK, which is where I grew up. And it's referenced in the book Citizens of London. And he says, the Americans were never merely them, and they rapidly became us. And I think that's such a fantastic compliment. I think that's such a moving thing to say, and really the essence of a special relationship. And I think that just rounds out a theme here with this whole story of two nations and actually all the allies working together against remarkable odds to save the world. As I mentioned at the beginning in the finest hour speech, Churchill said, Hitler knows he must break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free. In those darkest hours, there was still an intent to set Europe free because of our principles of democracy. And on the walls of the cemetery of Coleville-sur-Mer, the American cemetery, is this beautiful epitaph that basically says, if ever proof were needed that we fought for a cause and not for conquest, it could be found in these cemeteries. Here was our only conquest. All we asked was enough soil in which to bury our gallant dead. Again, I think that's remarkably poignant when you consider the monumental effort and struggles and death that occurred to reconquer Europe. And then it was all given back. It was all given back, even to Germany. And I think that just speaks volumes to the principles, values of the people that did that and the world's great democracies. As I said at the beginning, Churchill said, all great things are simple, and many of them can be described in single words. I think these themes in this story just echo that: the leadership, planning, execution, and the relationships. Again, remarkable story. I've learned a lot since that day in June of 2002 when I visited my uncle's grave. I had no idea what those people did. It's truly remarkable. I can't say enough. If you ever get the chance to Normandy, please go. You will not regret it. That's the end of my presentation. I'm always happy to take questions if anybody has any. This is a little weird for me doing it virtually, just speaking to a computer. But if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them.
It's been a fantastic presentation, Steve. Thank you so much. Again, for those of you who joined after the beginning, I am Cale Wilcox with the Museum of Flight. I'm going to relay questions from the chat to Steve here now. First one comes up, Steve. Can you speak at all to General Hap Arnold's role in planning air operations on the American side for D-Day?
Not too much. I'm familiar with him at a very top level, but it's not an area that I've drilled deep. So I'm sorry, but I don't know too much on that.
Fair enough. The next question up was, can you talk a little bit more about the deception efforts that led up to D-Day?
Yeah. So again, a lot of these was sort of masterminded by Bertram Ramsay. There was a huge effort to try and convince the Germans that they would attack Marseille in the south of France. And they always constantly tried to coax the Germans into thinking what the Germans wanted to think, which was the Pas de Calais, so either Dunkirk or Calais. So there was a lot of espionage going on, planning, information, deception, counterintelligence, to try and feed that information back to the German command and just keep them on their toes of where to deploy their resources. And they actually did a good job, because at the end of the day, Normandy was a relatively weaker section of the Atlantic Wall, although it was a little more heavily defended than they thought when they first went in. But yeah, deception was a key part of things. Yeah.
Okay, and I'll remind our audience, if you have questions for our speaker, go ahead and post them in the chat function. Can you, the next question up here is, can you tell us anything you know about Garbo, G-A-R-B-O?
I don't know what that is.
Me neither, I'm afraid. I actually had a question pop to my mind, Steve. You mentioned that the Luftwaffe didn't really make an appearance over the beaches of Normandy. Was that because there were not enough airplanes left in Germany, or was that a tactical decision on the Germans' part to hold back their aircraft?
Primarily, by that point, the Luftwaffe was near broken. The very few operational aircraft, and those that were, had they gone to the skies, they would have been shot down in such short times. It's just, as I said, with the numbers, just overwhelming air power from the Allies at that point. So very minimal resources, air resources from the Luftwaffe in that area at the time. Yeah.
Okay. The next question up here is, how much of a role did the French have in the operation?
Well, a lot. The resistance was very effective, and again, helped lay the seeds of deception, and then helped secure some of the key points, bridges, supply lines. Obviously, they wanted to secure key bridges for the Allies and destroy supply lines for the Germans. The French resistance were very active in that.
And you said there were some French soldiers that landed as part of the invasion force?
I don't have too much information on that. There were, I just don't know the facts and figures. There were quite a few French soldiers that were evacuated back to Britain after Dunkirk, tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but tens of thousands. And I would expect a lot of those guys who would have been involved in the invasion, not necessarily on the initial assault, but the subsequent waves of folks that came in. Remember, D-Day was just the first steps. They said 156,000 men were deployed on that day, but afterwards it was almost 3 million were deployed. A lot of them through the Mulberry Harbors.
Excellent. There was some clarification in the chat here in that it just scrolled by. Garbo was the code name for a key German agent who had been turned over to the Brits. And he apparently helped with pre-invasion deception. So there's some clarification for that.
Yeah, not too familiar with that piece.
There was another question here. Were the airships in that photo of the beach German or Allied?
Oh, let's see. I go back to it.
I believe that was the barrage balloons that are being referenced there.
Yeah, no, those were. Let's see if I can find the picture. Those were used, they're really anti-aircraft devices. They were used to protect the beaches to prevent aircraft from strafing them. You may recall they deployed a lot of those things over London. There were huge steel cables that held those things in place. So any aircraft that would try and fly in, if they hit one of those cables, it would just basically slice the wing off.
Okay, let me make sure. There's been a lot of accolades, Steve, posted in the chat here. A lot of people saying fantastic and interesting presentation for sure.
Oh, thank you.
Steve, you had mentioned to me in the run-up to this program that if people wanted a copy of your presentation, you'd be happy to share it with them. How would they go about getting that from you?
Well, I'll be happy to give you a copy of the presentation. You can send it to them, or trade emails or whatever.
Okay, perfect.
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Sorry, there's just a lot of stuff going by in the chat window quickly. Somebody here is saying thank you for sharing your personal photos, and I echo that. It adds an interesting touch to a topic when there is a personal connection to it like that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's really what motivated me to drill deeper. I think, when it's somebody else, it seemed, I don't know if it's sort of less interest, but when it's your family, it sort of brings it closer. And it was very moving for me to go visit that grave. I was 42 when we did that, so not a young man, but younger. And I was just really moved to stand over that man's grave. He was 26 when he got shot, left 4 kids. And he's just one out of millions and millions that did that. And it just comes back to the whole concept of respect and remembrance for what these people did in the course of freedom. I mean, it's truly remarkable and inspiring.
Absolutely. Here's a good question. How much did the operation cost? I'm sure there's a few different ways you could slice that, but
yeah, that's a good question. I honestly have no idea. I wouldn't know. I haven't even tried to look that up. That'd be an interesting exercise. Clearly a lot. Just the sheer numbers are staggering in terms of ships, aircraft, men, people, logistics. I mean, the harbors themselves must have cost a small fortune. But what's the price of freedom? Yeah, a lot of money.
Absolutely.
But well worth it.
I'll mention for those of you in the chat who are requesting copies of the presentation, if you reply to the confirmation email you received when you registered for this program, that reply will actually go to me, and just let me know that you're interested in that, and I will make sure we get that to you. Let's see, any other questions here? Still a lot more thanks coming through to you, Steve.
It's okay.
At this point, I'll check. I'll wait and see here if there's a couple more questions. I did post a link in the chat for those of you who might have seen it. It probably scrolled by pretty fast. Our public programs here at the Museum of Flight are free when they are in the virtual realm, such as they are right now. However, we are very appreciative of any kind of financial contribution people are willing to make to the museum. So I'm dropping a link into the chat right now that takes you to our support public programs page on our website if anybody is interested in doing that. If you do want to go to that page, you will have to copy and paste that link from the chat window, I do believe. And yeah, so Steve, I'm not seeing any other questions come through now. Oh, here we go. Spoke too soon. Oh, here's a good one, aviation specific. Are there any specific aircraft that you like the most in the World War II era, Steve? What's your favorite World War II plane?
Oh, it's got to be the Spitfire. So, yeah, another personal presentation that I have is one on Dunkirk because of my grandfather's involvement there. And, one of the reasons Dunkirk was successful was actually not because of the Navy, but because of the Air Force. And it was during that campaign that the Royal Air Force started turning the tide. Instead of being shot down at the ratio of 2 to 1, they turned that around so that they were shooting down the Luftwaffe at a rate of 2 to 1. And in fact increased that to almost 3 to 1 or 4 to 1. The reason for that was that Dunkirk was the first operation which used the Spitfire Mark 1. There is a wonderful documentary on Netflix that if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's just called Spitfire, the Plane That Saved the World. And it's a recent production just a couple of years ago, 2018, for the centennial anniversary of the Royal Air Force. And it tells the whole story of the aircraft. One of the reasons it's near and dear to me is that it was designed at the Supermarine factory in Eastleigh, which is right next door to Southampton University in the UK, which is where I got my degree in aeronautics and astronautics. So sort of close to home for me. And then the first target to be bombed in Britain in the Second World War was actually the Spitfire factory in Castle Bromwich near Birmingham. We used to live just up the road from that place, about 3 miles away, Sutton Coldfield. So the two major sites for the design production of that aircraft, sort of very near and dear to my heart. But just its history and its accomplishments are remarkable. They made 24 variants of the Spitfire. It evolved from a very simple design to, a lethal killing machine. So yeah, that's my favorite plane.
The person who asked the question, Mike, says, good answer.
Thank you.
A lot of Spitfire fans in the room tonight. Okay, well, that's going to bring us to the close of the program tonight. I don't see any more questions coming in here. So, Steve, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge of D-Day with us. It was greatly appreciated. And again, thanks to everybody who tuned in tonight and joined this program. Like I said, we're adjusting to this new virtual realm for public programs at the Museum of Flight for the time being. And so we appreciate everybody making that adjustment with us. So once again, Steve, thank you. We hope to see you again soon. It's been a pleasure to be able to host you tonight. And Mary Batterson from the museum mentions, and also thank you, Stuart, for your IT support. So be
thank
sure
you
to
both.
pass that along to him on our behalf as well. He saved the day for sure.
Say hi to Mary for me.
I absolutely will. Excellent. Okay, well, this is the conclusion of our program, everybody. Thank you again for coming, and thank you, Steve, and good night, and please enjoy the rest of your weekends. We hope to see you back at the Museum of Flight as soon as we can.
Yeah. Good night, everybody. Thank you.